My name is Larry Few. I'm director of the Global Affairs Center here at the college, and today's topic is Cuba. Cuba is a Caribbean nation. They will talk about that of about 11 million people that's experiencing internal and external changes, most notably the thaw in relations with the United States. Given that the U.S. embargo on trade with and travel to Cuba has been in place since 1961, before most of you were born, it's not surprising that most Americans know very little about this place. What's daily life like in Cuba? How do Cubans make a living? What are their hopes and dreams? So today's speakers, to my left here, Tim Payne and Tod O'Driscoll, I'll introduce both of them a little bit in just a moment. They have both traveled to Cuba in recent years, and they're going to share some of their observations and images of this small but complex country that is changing. Tim Payne, to my far left, right there, has taught economics and international studies here at Shoreline for more than 30 years. He has a long-standing interest in sustainable development and the powers of local organizations in improving lives of individuals and communities. Some of his early economic research was on sustainable agriculture development here in the Pacific Northwest. Agriculture and energy, I should say, in the Pacific Northwest. That research has inspired him to explore principles and practices of sustainability in other parts of the world, including Southeast Asia, Central America, and most recently, I think, in Cuba. Tod, to my left here, in the plaid shirt, has been photographing professionally for some 25 years. He has worked all over the U.S. as well as in Uganda, Ethiopia, Mexico, and Cuba. He's here to share some of his images and observations. His work has been published by the Washington Post, the Associated Press, DreamWorks Television, the Congressional Quarterly Magazine, and Partners in Action. Closer to home, his work has also been featured in the Tacoma News Tribune, Seattle Pacific University, and other publications. With that, please join me in welcoming Tim Payne and Tod O'Driscoll.
Hi. Well, I'm Tim. I teach economics and international studies here at Shoreline. I've had quite a lot of experiences internationally traveling as an economist. Going to Cuba was like going to Disneyland for an economist. Everywhere I looked, there was something going on that was, wow, look at that. That's so different than life in our economic system. What I'm going to try to do is give you a little bit of a feel of what life is like there, but also talk about their economic system, why they have a different economic system than us. They call themselves socialists, and what that looks like in Cuba. And that means we need to talk a little bit about some of the history there. These are my photos. You're going to see some of Tod's later. You know, you could look at this and say, what decade am I in? Well, this was 2 years ago in Cuba. Famous for having lots of old cars because there's been an economic embargo placed on them by the United States where they're not able to buy new cars. So they make do with what they have. And sometimes it's old, sometimes it doesn't work well. And something that's come out of that is that they have a sense of ingenuity of how to make things work that is it's remarkable at times, and that was one of my fascinations there. You can also see, though, there's, high fashion with the old cars there. There's a juxtaposition of times going on in Cuba, and that's one thing that's happening there, is that life is really changing quickly. One of the things I loved there is that people still talk with each other directly as opposed to with their thumbs on a smartphone. And they don't have smartphones because of an economic embargo. And it was refreshing to see people the age of our students just out, on the streets, interacting, having a good time. The street life is vibrant there, daytime and nighttime. People will be out on the streets in their neighborhoods with their neighbors and families associating. Of course, it's hot at night, so they need to get out of their hot houses. But throughout the city, I walked around a lot in Havana, and I was just really impressed with the street culture that is going on there. This is a restaurant in Old Havana. Cuba is known for its arts, music, and dance. I knew about it. I have a collection of Cuban music. I had no idea how much it was going to be around almost everywhere I went. It was contagious, and I learned how to samba dance. or a salsa dance to the samba. There's also a lot of art going on there, and this is something I didn't know about, is their mastery in art. And it's really growing as an occupation in Cuba. This is one way Cubans can supplement their income on top of the government check they all get, is they can sell their art. If they're musicians, they can sell their CDs. This is the performance of one of the most famous Cuban bands. This is the Buena Vista Social Club. You might have heard about them. There was a movie done on them. This is at the National Hotel in Havana, and it was just a real special performance. Even here's street musicians just out on the street. This is again in old Havana. A few more shots of Havana in the countryside. That's a bus. And yeah, if you can't buy buses because of an embargo, you make do with what you have. Another thing Cuba is famous for is shortages of goods and services. Because of an embargo, they have a shortage of a lot of consumer goods and services, so they have rationing programs. And by rationing, we mean there's a limited amount of food and gas and lots of things, and you got to stand in line to get it. And these folks are standing in line for milk. This is our guide in Cuba. He's showing us his ration book. This is the way they ration things. Some people might remember or have heard of historically that we did this in World War II in the United States when we had our own shortages. This is how we rationed. This book, you have to, every time you purchase everything from what's that? Beef, chicken, milk, vegetables, gasoline, you have to mark it down. The vendor marks it down in the book, and you are limited to how much you can buy. These folks are standing in line for milk, the big line. Once they get done here, they go over here, and this is a line for just eggs. This is in Havana. This across the water here is an old Spanish fort. They were initially a Spanish colony for hundreds of years. Here's Cuba, not very far off the tip of Florida there, about 90 miles, I think, is the separation there, and yet an entirely different world. They're a little bit of politics and economics. Their economy is a socialist economy. What does that mean? It means the government owns a lot of property and controls a lot of the industries and businesses. If you stay at a hotel, it's a government hotel. It's not a private for-profit corporation. In fact, the hotels and restaurants are run by the military there, which was interesting. About 85% of their workforce works in the public sector, in other words, for the government. So that's where most of the jobs are. Politically, they've got one party, the Communist Party, and that becomes a controversy because of our ideals of political freedom, and clearly two is better than one. We got two parties, they got one, so beat them by one there. Because of what's going on in their economy, you see a lot of things like this old pickup that somehow is barely running at all, and to me that's somewhat symbolic of parts of their economy, where it's working but barely. Other parts are working really pretty well. A lot of their infrastructure, not just their cars, but their buildings and sidewalks are just in ruins because they can't get construction materials, because the United States won't let those things come in. So you see a lot of buildings that are in various stages of crumbling. This is somebody's house, and he's very proud of his house here. If you can see him, here it is, my mansion with all these wires running through. I hope you can see how his stairway is propped up here. That board is holding it. This is what happens when you can't get basic materials to run your economy. Cubans will patch things together and make it work. These chairs are kind of an image of that to me. Some of their patchwork is very ingenious, though. A little economic comparison between the United States and Cuba. Our GDP per capita, average income, is quite a bit higher than theirs. We spend more on health care in this country by far in dollars, and even as a percent of our economy, we spend a lot more. But Cuba is socialist, so everyone is covered by health care, regardless of ability to pay. Old and young, retired and working, all covered. If you look at our life expectancies, the results of the healthcare system, it's very comparable. Even though they spend a lot less, their infant mortality rates are actually lower than ours, so kids have a better chance of surviving. Their educational system is also top rate. They actually have higher literacy in Cuba than we have in America. When I talked with Cubans, and they would come talk with me, they would say, there's 3 things about Cuba that are better than your country. They were very proud of it. And they would say it's our educational system. Everybody gets it, regardless of ability to pay. They said our medical care system. And the third one caught me off guard. They said, you know, we Cubans have a sense of community. We are all in this together. You Americans are individualistic. And we think that we're better than you. So, quite a value judgment. But as I was there for a while, they convinced me that that was really the truth. Little bit of history for you. Some of you might recognize these revolutionaries of the Cuban Revolution. On the left is Fidel Castro. In the middle, the current president of Cuba, his younger brother Raul Castro. On the right, the very famous revolutionary fighter Che Guevara. What was the revolution about? Well, there's some history. As we said, Cuba was a Spanish colony until 1898. Spain lost that colony, but the U.S. quickly moved in with quite a bit of occupation and dominance. Most of the land and the businesses were owned by a few wealthy Cubans and by U.S. corporations that had a big ownership of a lot of that country, including some corporations you might be familiar with that owned a lot of Cuba. Most of the people were not benefiting from that. Most people were landless peasants that owned nothing. Very high illiteracy and poverty, high unemployment rates, and under a dictatorship of Batista, who was a friend of the corporations and wealthy landowners. Well, this wasn't working for most Cuban people. And there was a revolution. And there's an amazing, fascinating story of this. There are a few good movies on this, including that Che movie, if you've seen that before. There's a part 1 and part 2. Pretty amazing how just a few guys used guerrilla warfare to take over a country. But they got it. And you can see this was right after the revolution. This is central Havana. Peasants were coming from everywhere going, all right, we got it. Oh, what do they got? The United States didn't like that because part of what they got was property that formerly belonged to U.S. corporations. Of course, the U.S. government maybe doesn't approve of that. That's happened in other countries too. And our response to them is that we're going to not do trade with you. We're going to shut you off. That embargo started in 1960. It goes on until today. One thing I'll point out, a lot of people think the economic embargo is over. It is not. What has happened in the last few months is an increase in diplomatic relations, which means we now have embassies in each other's countries, and we're talking with each other more. The embargo is still going on. Some things have been loosened a bit, but there are still, because of the shortage of things, there are shortages of goods, tools, raw materials, and technologies there. But in the 1960s, the Soviet Union came along and said, here's an opportunity to establish ourselves in another part of the world. And here we have the good friend relationship between Fidel and the premier of the Soviet Union at that time, Khrushchev. And they got a lot of trade and aid from the Soviet Union. That went on for a couple decades. But boy, it ended quick when the Soviet Union collapsed. No more trade, no more aid. Cuba was now again shut off. And they went through a couple years where their economy just collapsed. They call it the special period during peacetime. Nice way of saying they were starving. They had to cut their social programs by 78%. There were shortages of food, medicine, and essentials, huge agricultural shortages because they couldn't grow their food because they couldn't get the fertilizers and pesticides that are normally used to do it. Cubans saw this as an opportunity. If you can't get the chemicals to grow your food, then you better figure out how to grow it without chemicals. That means organic. And this dilemma that we just talked about, the shortages, the limited productivity, created this great opportunity. That's why I went there. I went with a group of professionals that were looking at their sustainable agriculture. They are now a leader in organic and sustainable agriculture in the world because they figured out how to do it, but they're also very scientific in their approach to things. They're a very educated, literate population, and it was just really interesting to see how they've studied this. They have also done some, as well as organic agriculture, they've done some privatization of farms. In other words, you can own your own farm and keep some of the produce from it. These are some organic farms using worm compost right in the city of Havana, and some really good food. These are community farms, shared farms right in the city. There are supposedly in the city tens of thousands of farms in the city of Havana. And you'd go, how can you have tens of thousands of farms? Well, some of them are not that big. This is a Cuban scientist showing one of the medium-sized farms, but this is a small farm in someone's yard. So various size, but in all cases, they grow the food, and now they can keep it or sell it. And that's a huge change in the country. Oh, by the way, there's some that's organic lunch. And, oh, it was so good. Fruits, vegetables, edible flowers. It's also created an opportunity for Cubans to make a living. Now they can grow produce and sell it and supplement their family income. This was a relatively big change in Cuba that's just happened in the last few years. Privatization. You can keep some of your income from your business. This is a farmer's market that's a new thing in Cuba. And now Cubans can go shopping at places where there's not shortages and not rationing, well, as long as they've got the money to buy it. That's how capitalism works. It's more of a farmer's market. Looks a little like Pike Place Market, doesn't it? And yeah, they can earn cash. And so this is part of what The Economist magazine was referring to a couple years ago, that there is now a movement towards capitalism in Cuba, this allowance for new private businesses and private jobs where families can keep some of their own money. That's not been good enough for the United States. We are still doing the embargo on them and limiting trade. Some of these changes, there are now about 200 occupations that are allowed. Well, at the time there might be more now, but at the time I did this research, about 200 jobs are now legal to do, no government restrictions. There's more private sector employment. That means more private businesses going along. You're now allowed to own some of your land rather than it being property of the government. And a new change in the last couple of years, you're now allowed to buy and sell your own home. It's no longer government property. So you just see a lot of changes in the lives of Cubans, how they work, how they live, how they shop. And I think I might just show you a few pictures without saying a lot. Although this one I could say something. These are two new occupations, driving a taxi and selling food on the street. You can now do legally. This guy was selling chocolate. Another form of taxi in Cuba. Legal occupation. Another form of taxi, pedal cabs. Here's Cuban ingenuity. They're going to make a pedal cab out of scrap metal. A lot of this is just pictures of life in the street because it is so vibrant. Looks a little like Europe in a lot of ways. Not quite the oppressive society that sometimes we hear about in the media. That is a big cigar. This is the main harbor area of Havana called the Malecón, and that National Hotel is the big building to the right there. It's the main intersection of town. Havana's Times Square. Looks like from 50 years ago. And that's what I got to show you. We're going to turn it over to Tod next. While Tod's setting up, I want to just throw out one thing for you. I think a lot of people are interested in traveling to Cuba. There are still restrictions on traveling legally as a tourist, but one of the ways you can travel quite legally is through educational programs. That's what I was doing. I'm just going to say, we got educational programs on this campus. And if we thought there was sufficient interest in taking a group to Cuba, I'd help you figure out how to do it. And in the back, there's a table back there. If you're interested in travel to Cuba through Shoreline, I'd like to get your name and email address, and I'll get back to you once we have more information. I will say it's not cheap. One of the most expensive countries I've traveled in because of shortages. It's costly, but I would guarantee you something you won't forget. Are there any other countries that participate in the embargo? The answer is no. It's only the United States. You might say, well then why don't they have Japanese cars or European cars there? How the embargo works is pretty interesting. The short answer is that the way the embargo works is that the United States embargoes any ship that either picks up goods or takes goods to Cuba. They will say that ship cannot come to the United States for, I think it's a 9-month or 12-month period. It cannot legally come to the United States. Well, if you're a shipping company, why would you take a chance on not being able to do business with that big rich country up north because you stopped at that poor little country in the south? So the shipping companies will not do business with them because they want to make profits. And that's how the embargo works. So it makes it difficult for them to get goods from almost anywhere.
Okay, great. Thank you all for coming. I'll go ahead and get started right now. Thank you, Larry. Okay, I went in the first time in May of 2013, and I went again in July of last year, 2014. So I'm just going to go through these, and this is just these guys hanging out and playing dominoes late at night. And this is a common sight there. It's a popular game. And baseball is, I would say, the #1 sport there. It's one of the most popular sports in the country. And this is in Trinidad. This kid is safe on third base there. So they just play wherever they can. Literally on the street, the kids will just start playing baseball or soccer. And this is a game of soccer right across from the Malecon, kind of late in the day, and they're just playing in front of this, really underneath this old building that's has seen better days. Let's put it that way. This young girl just in central Havana, hanging out on the street. And this was actually in Trinidad. These young ladies are obviously pregnant, and they're living in a home for pregnant ladies. It's a state-run home. And I was walking along, and one of them motioned for me to come inside, and I was kind of shocked, because it's a private, it's a government-run home. And so I went inside and photographed some of them, and some of them are quite young, like maybe 14, 15, 16. And I think some of them have issues with their pregnancy, so they need to be monitored at all times during the pregnancy. But there was about 30 to 40 beds in this. It was a really big room, probably about the size of this room, or maybe even a little bit bigger. And this kid was waiting for his boxing practice to start, waiting for the other boys to arrive. This is in Old Havana, what they would refer to as Havana Vieja, which means Old Havana. And this is once the practice had actually started. And basketball is not a very popular sport there. This is the only time I ever saw any kids playing basketball. In fact, I don't think I ever saw it on the second trip. This is actually in 2013, my first trip. But this is directly across from the Malecon. And this gentleman, he's a musician. The way he makes his living is he plays for tourists. This is in Old Havana. So tourists will give him money he plays out there in the square. And of course, music is, as Tim mentioned, music is pretty much everywhere. It's a very integral part of their lives. They love music, and they have a number of different types of Cuban music. So this is at a restaurant in Trinidad, actually, and people dancing there. And this is some mother walking her daughter to school early in the morning. And the schools there are all, oftentimes you see people walking to school because a lot of people there don't have cars. And so they either have to take the bus or the parents will walk them to school. And they don't have to walk very far. It's not like they have to walk 2 or 3 miles. The schools are all, there's a number of schools, so they can pretty much get there pretty quickly. And these are some people waiting for the bus. As I mentioned, there's a lot of people that take the bus there because they can't afford to own a car. And these guys are playing checkers while they're waiting on the bus to show up. And this is one of the buses there. As you can see, there's different ages from young to old there. And this is another bus. This is actually out in Vinales, which is a rural area where they grow a lot of tobacco. And you can see this bus is in pretty bad shape. But this is a bus that Cubans will take. This kind of bus. It's not a bus that foreigners would take or tourists would take. And this is a panaderia. This young boy is just waiting his turn in line to buy some bread. And as you can see up there on there's a portrait of Che Guevara, who was, as Tim mentioned, one of the leaders of the revolution. And he tried to export it to other countries. He left in, I believe, 1965, and he went to Bolivia, and he was gunned down by the Bolivian army in, I believe, 1968. And this is an old car. It's I believe it's a 1953 Chevy. They were just gassing it up. But like I said, not a lot of people have the money to be able to afford a car. So, certainly not everyone owns a car. You have to have a little bit more money to be able to buy it and afford the gas and everything. And this is a government worker who's getting some affection from a friend. And there's a lot of payphones there. Unlike the U.S., where payphones here have pretty much disappeared. There you see a lot of payphones because not everyone has a cell phone. But cell phones are becoming, more people are getting cell phones there. And that's happened just in the last few years. And young teens just hanging out. He's got the earbuds or earplugs there, listening to an MP3 player or his phone. And this was taken in 2014. This is the first tablet I ever saw in Cuba. So this was the trip from last year. And I was when I saw that, I was like, I got to get a picture of that because that was the first time I'd ever seen that in Cuba. So, and this young man is just waiting across the street. And this kind of picture embodies to me what is the new Cuba. They're kind of starting to change, as Tim mentioned, and being able to own their own businesses now and that kind of thing. And these are some guys that are wealthier Cubans. As you can tell by the way they're dressed, they have some money. And so the guy on the left has a Gucci shirt. I don't know if you can see it, see the writing there, but and it kind of shows also that there's a lot of I think the races there in some ways maybe there's not quite as much racism as there is in the U.S. From what I could tell. That's just my own personal observation. but the races seem to get along pretty well. I mean, I'm not saying that there isn't racism there, but because there is, but the races seem to get along pretty well. And this guy was walking along, and then I noticed he had a interesting belt buckle, so I asked him if I could photograph. He said yes, and as you can tell, who is the gentleman on his belt buckle? Can you guys see who that is? President Obama, yeah. And also, it's one of those belt buckles that changes, so there's also a picture, you can't really see it, but I think the other picture on there was Hugo Chavez. Of course, he's now dead, but this picture was taken in 2013, so he was still living at the time. And these young couple just got caught on a rough sea day, trying to not get too wet. Of course, they got soaked there as the water's coming over. And this is in Trinidad at a barber shop. You can't really see, you kind of lose a lot of the detail in the background because of this slide, but in the original picture you can see it's a barber shop, and you can see a Cuban flag in the background. And this is in Trinidad. It's these people are lining up to purchase their eggs and different supplies, and she's filling out their ration card. I Tim mentioned that earlier. And this is at another little place where people can get their milk, and this is in Trinidad, get their ration of milk for the week. This is a gentleman in Cienfuegos who was actually begging me for money. He seemed to be pretty poor. And they really live their lives on the streets. It's kind of very different culture than ours here in the U.S. They hang out. They do a lot of hang out on their porch or on the sidewalk or in the streets, just hanging out with their family, their neighbors, and their friends, and having a beer or and this is the Malecon late at night, and there was a ton of young people down here, and it was quite late at night. It was about 10, 11 o'clock at night, I think, at this point. And you can see the cops walking by. There was actually a pretty heavy police presence down there, I think because there were so many people hanging out. And so, and again, this is the Malecon, a different part of the Malecon as the sun's going down. And this gentleman is an artist. As you can see, some of his artwork there. He's working on a painting in Trinidad. And it's one of the businesses that they can own their own businesses now. So it's one examples of business. And here's a restaurant in Trinidad, and again another example of a business that they can legally own. And they can now employ not only just their family members, but also people that are not related to them. Whereas before the law changed, they had to only employ family members. They could not employ anybody that was not a family member. And this is a little store in Trinidad. Okay. All right. And again, a little store that sells orange juice and that kind of thing. And this is a guy just working on his old car. Or has a shop where he fixes cars, old car. And this is a pharmacy in Trinidad. Okay. Guy taking his chickens to the market. This guy's making cigars in Vinales. This guy in Vinales is hanging out. And this is a scene from Vinales. I don't know. It's a rural area where they grow a lot of the tobacco and also other crops as well. And it rained really hard, and so these guys were just. This guy was trying to cross what had become a river, really, trying to cross the field on his horse. So, it's a farmer out in Vinales. Okay, and it's a couple in their home. As you can see on the right, there's a portrait of Che Guevara, and on the left is another leader of the revolution, Cienfuegos. The government office, and it's rare that you see anymore these days. It's rare that you see a portrait of Fidel anywhere. This is like maybe the only one I saw when I was there, because he's kind of fading. He's still alive, but he's kind of fading away. And this is CDR stands for Committee for the Defense of the Revolution, which each neighborhood has a CDR, which means that basically what it means is it's a place where people hang out, but people are also being spied on by their neighbors. So if they say something that is considered derogatory against the government, they can get in trouble for that. So, yeah. Okay. All right. And yeah, this is a church in Havana. Let's go here real quickly. And Malecon here. Okay, we're just about done here. Again, the Malecon fishing. And yeah, that's the last one. You guys jumping in. Okay. All right. Actually, it's things have changed now in the last year, but basically, if you're going as part of a people-to-people exchange group, then you can actually fly directly from the U.S., like fly from Miami directly to Havana. But when I went, I was going there for professional work, for work reasons, professional reasons, because I didn't mention this, but I'm actually working on a book of photography on Cuba. And so I flew from the U.S. to Cancun, and then from Cancun to Havana directly. But now things have changed, so it's a little bit different. But yeah, so that. But once I got to Cuba, I traveled by taxi and by bus. I went by bus from say Havana to Trinidad, and Havana to Vinales. Actually, no, I take that back. From Havana to Vinales, I went by taxi. But it was, yeah.
Same thing. We flew from the U.S. to Cancun and then over to Havana because I was part of an officially recognized travel group, traveling legally. We had our own bus and driver for the parts of the program we were in, so we didn't have to arrange our own transportation.
Okay. Another question here is, did the people of Cuba ever voice their concerns about being oppressed or challenged in any way?
Yes. The second trip, there was a number of people that would come up to us. I went with an interpreter, and there was a number of people that would come up to us and just say, hey, they started talking about how bad the government was and all this stuff. And it kind of made me nervous because, it is a one-party state. I mean, it's a communist government. And so, it kind of made me nervous because, you don't really know who's watching you and listening to you. And so that was a little bit unsettling. But yeah, I don't know. I don't want. I could say more, but in the interest of time,
People felt fairly free with us, at least, to criticize their government, although they would also give the government credit for their education. Sorry. Sorry about that. They would give credit for their educational system and their healthcare system, as I mentioned earlier. People did have criticisms that the government got in the way of them making money. And that's kind of how socialism can work. So these capitalist reforms will be addressing that, I think, as time goes by.
Okay. Another question is, did you visit any schools, be primary, secondary, or colleges and universities while you were in Cuba? And how are they similar or different from what you see here in the United States?
Our group visited a couple universities and had presentations from their faculty and some graduate students doing research there. Other than the buildings were in a state of disrepair, it was pretty much like being in a university classroom here. They had a projector and PowerPoint slides, and people were falling asleep, just like in your classes. So, yeah.
No, I never. I don't think I ever actually visited a school. But I did interact. I did photograph, school kids, like in their uniforms, and but I didn't actually And I did photograph kids that were in a classroom from the outside, but I didn't actually go in and interact, in the classroom. So never had that opportunity.
Another education-related question, and I have a personal interest in this since I have a daughter in medical school here in the U.S. The question is, this medical school, is it free or heavily subsidized in Cuba?
Free.
I believe it's free, yeah. Yeah.
All education is free,
And
provided by the government. Somebody's paying for it, but the government is.
Yeah, and they actually export doctors to many other, a lot of other countries like Venezuela. They give them doctors, and then, they've been getting oil from Venezuela in exchange for giving them doctors that go and serve for.
Cuban doctors are doing relief work around the world.
Yeah.
They're doing work in Africa and other parts of Latin America, and so they really do practice what they preach in terms of getting out there and doing good in other parts of the world, and especially with their medical professionals.
Okay, while in Cuba, what did you see in Cuba that made you appreciate what you have here in the United States?
Groceries.
Yeah.
You go shopping there, you have limited choices. And some people have asked me, oh, did you eat a lot of that good Cuban food? And I would no. I was eating tourist food, and we're lucky to get it. I love Cuban sandwiches. I don't think most Cuban families eat Cuban sandwiches because it's so hard to get the meat, for example.
Right. Yeah, I think. Right. I think we do have more freedom in this country than they have, and so I think that and also just the opportunity to make a better living and make more money. There's of course a lot more to life than that, but yeah, and the food, yeah, the food is. I had some good food there, but it really depends on. I had the best meal I had was in Trinidad, and it was this lobster meal that I paid about $14 for, and in the U.S. that would cost about $60 or more, and it was incredible. It was like meal and dessert and like a mojito for about $14. So it was like, yeah.
Okay, last question from up here. Maybe there's some other questions out there, but I guess this is as much for Tim. But the cost of gasoline in Cuba, how much was it, and where do they get their oil and gasoline from?
The first question, I really don't have the answer to the cost of it. I only saw one gas station the whole time I was there, and they didn't have their prices posted, so I don't know. Like everything that's there, it's subsidized by the government, and it's provided by the government. And you might have to have a special permission just to buy it. That I don't know. And we were in a bus, so we weren't going out and buying the gas that way. The second part I can answer more clearly. They get their oil from Venezuela. After the Soviet Union cut them off, they were in a world of hurt for shortages. And the country of Venezuela, especially under the leadership of Hugo Chavez, gave them a lot of aid in terms of oil. And some of the main trade going on was with Venezuela.
Okay, well, we're just about out of time here. I hope that everyone's enjoyed Tim and Todd's remarks, and I'd like to give them all another round of applause. Thank you. And before you leave, we'd ask you to please take a moment and complete the survey in your program that you received as you entered the room. Your feedback is very important to us in planning future programs. Students,